You've been considering different instances of walls which divide people in situations where there has been profound division and conflict. And you've seen the ways in which these can have different origins. The Cold War origins of the Berlin context are different, obviously, in some ways from Gaza, which differs again in other ways from the context of the peace wars between the different communities here in Northern Ireland, from where I'm speaking to you now. But there are similarities also between them, aren't there? That wars which are put up sometimes in the interests of supposedly making the conflict less tense, less violent, can also have an aggravating effect, as well as one which reinforces the security on either side of the wall. And the context as it changes over time will vary, often in unpredictable ways. Who would have predicted, for example, that during the peace process in Northern Ireland, when there has been far less murderous political violence, the number of peace walls dividing Protestant, Unionist, Loyalist on the one side and Catholic, Nationalist, Republican on the other side, the number of peace walls has actually increased dramatically rather than reduced. One of the paradoxes here in Northern Ireland is that the peace process that we have here is one which is built on a comparatively peaceful segregation between two communities, rather than a resolution of the argument politically in a way which is harmonious. One of the things you might want to reflect on in your own contexts is whether that is the best you're likely to get. Are we really in conflict situations which have involved terrorism trying to look for a cold peace, where people continue not to like each other or to mix with each other or to go to the same schools, but decide for whatever pragmatic reasons that violence is not really in their interests as a community or a group? Or should we be more ambitious and try and think of ways in which we can bring down those walls, whether the physical walls which divide people street from street, or maybe the mental walls which divide different communities from one another in terms of their perceptions, their attitudes, their tolerance, and their engagement and trust? I think there are different arguments which will be pressing as you discuss and reflect on this, and it's not easy to find a final answer. I don't think I have a finally resolved argument about this myself. Sometimes I think that the kind of result that you get where people self-segregate in comparatively peaceful ways seems like a huge achievement when you compare it to the violence which came before. At other times it seems to me that by reinforcing that segregation you might just be stirring up difficulties for a future generation, and that if those divisions persist, then the dehumanizing attitudes that people can sustain in those contexts make it easier to think of violence being legitimate against another group. Certainly in Northern Ireland, as in Israel-Palestine, it's far easier to consider violence as legitimate against the other group the less intimately and humanly you know that other group as normal human beings, as people who have the same kind of fears and aspirations and attitudes and cultures that you yourself have in your own individual and communal life. So as you're thinking about your own context, are there ways in which there are things that divide different people from each other within your own cities, within your own countries, which we should be trying to address? Should we try to remove those kinds of barriers in the hope of therefore making it more difficult for people in future to produce violent responses to communal segregation or difference? Are there things which governments, or which police services, or which NGOs, or which other actors, or which individuals in society should be doing to try and break down barriers and produce greater understanding? Are there things in terms of education, or in terms of the media, which we should be addressing? Is it the case, as I sometimes wonder whether it is, that the time to deal with terrorism is before it starts? In other words, between conflicts, to try and address things when there's more trust and when it's easier to deal with relationships across communal divisions. One of the things that the long history of terrorism undoubtedly teaches is that once the violence starts, you increase polarization. You make it more difficult for people to trust one another. You make it more difficult for people to work together as colleagues. You make it more difficult for people to go to school together. You make it less likely people will engage in leisure activities like sport, or will engage socially with one another in ways that will break down mistrust and break down divisions. So in a sense, it might be worth us thinking about not just those physical walls, as you saw in Gaza or in Berlin or in Belfast and other parts of Northern Ireland, but also thinking about the mental or the social or the attitudinal walls which divide people. And one crucial thing here is to think, should we be encouraging ways in which each of us can imagine more effectively what it's like to be the other person? When I taught for a long time at Queen's University in Belfast, the vast majority of the students I was teaching had been educated at school in separate schools. In other words, broadly speaking, the Catholic students had gone to a Catholic school and the Protestant students had gone to a school where almost everyone was likely to be a Protestant. The first time they were coming together in the classroom was at university, when they would meet people from a different community. It certainly wasn't my view that I had to try and change people's political views. What I did try and say to the students was that I would hope that at the end of the course they took, and I was teaching politics, a very sharp-edged subject here in Belfast, at the end of the course I hoped that they might have a greater understanding than they had at the start of what people in the other community thought and why they thought what they thought. I wasn't trying to get people to change their politics. I was trying to get people to think about why normal people on the other side of a physical wall or of an attitudinal wall in society might think as they think. Are there ways in which in your own contexts and settings there might be things which people could do to try and empathise and understand, even to tolerate, what seems sometimes threatening and different and alien, in ways which might make it less likely that people in future will express their divisions in ways that are violent or even terroristic?